What if the truth you thought was buried comes roaring back years later? What if the smiling face on the screen hides a storm behind the scenes? Tonight, a shocking testimony resurfaces, painting a picture of Hollywood that few dare to speak out loud. This is the story you were never meant to hear. The story begins with an ordinary young man stepping into an extraordinary world and finding himself face to face with the glittering illusion of fame that so many admire from afar and yet behind that curtain of lights, cameras, and glamour. He discovers something far darker than he expected, a shadow lurking just beneath the surface. A shadow that would haunt him for years to come. He was 23 years old, full of hope, energy, and the determination to learn everything he could about the entertainment industry. He secured a chance through connections to work on set of one of the most talked about television shows of its era, Gossip Girl, the show that had captivated audiences worldwide with its opulent scenes in Paris, New York, and beyond, a show that shaped the cultural imagination of a generation. He thought he was simply stepping into a dream, but little did he know that the dream would quickly dissolve into a chilling reality. His first encounter on set was not with chaos or disorganization, but with a contrast so stark that it burned itself into his memory forever. He met Leighton Meester, who smiled warmly, greeted him with kindness, and gave him the simple gift of acknowledgement that made him feel welcome in this intimidating new world. Then came the moment when he crossed paths with Blake. Lively, he mustered the courage to introduce himself to say hello, but what greeted him was silence and impenetrable wall. No eye contact, no warmth. Just cold dismissal for a young newcomer eager to make a good impression. This single moment was not just awkward, it was devastating, because while some may shrug off such behavior as trivial, he could feel the energy, the heaviness, the strange discomfort that clung to every interaction with her, and it was this energy that told him something was not right. He brushed it off at first, determined to stay focused on his responsibilities as a production assistant, ensuring water was stocked, equipment was in place, and crew members had what they needed. But the feeling would only intensify as days went on. Every step near her trailer felt like walking into an invisible storm, a tension that pressed against him and left him questioning himself. He began to notice whispers, quiet conversations spoken in tones just low enough that he could not make out the words, but the laughter that followed made it clear he was the subject of ridicule at one point. He caught her speaking in English with a team member, believing perhaps that he would not understand the full meaning, but he could feel the sting of being mocked. The uneasy realization that the glamorous star he had admired from afar was turning her attention to belittling someone far below her on the professional ladder. The dissonance was overwhelming because he was still in awe of being part of a massive production, still young enough to think that every moment on set was a gift, and yet now those gifts were laced with dread. Every time he entered her orbit, he felt as though he was shrinking under the weight of unseen hostility. And while no harsh slurs were uttered, no physical altercation took place. The message was loud and clear: you are beneath me, you do not matter, you are disposable. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she was having a bad day. Perhaps the stress of constant filming had taken its toll. Perhaps fame itself had twisted the way she viewed those around her, but deep down he knew that this was more than stress. It was a pattern, because as he spoke quietly with others in similar low-ranking roles, he began to realize that his experience was not unique. Others too had felt the same cutting coldness, the same dismissiveness, the same sense of being invisible, or worse, being a target for derision. What made it all the more surreal was the stark contrast between perception and reality on screen. She was idolized, a heroine draped in couture dazzling audiences worldwide, yet off-screen. To those who worked closest in the shadows of production, the story was far different. This was not just about one ignored hello. This was about a culture, a climate of fear, a toxic undertone that left young crew members afraid to make mistakes, afraid even to make eye contact, and it gnawed at him, because at 23 years old, all he wanted was to learn to grow, to be part of something meaningful. Instead, he found himself doubting his worth, questioning if he would be fired for some imagined offense. And it is here that the irony strikes hardest, because years later, when allegations of toxic environments surfaced, and when lawsuits began to swirl, one could not help but see the glaring contradiction. The very person who had accused others of fostering toxicity was herself accused of embodying it. And the weight of that irony would not be lost on him or on those who later came forward. He held back for years, silenced not by contracts, but by fear. Fear of retaliation. Fear of reputational damage. Fear of what might happen to his own budding career. And yet time has a way of uncovering what is hidden. It gives strength to voices once too shaken to speak. And now, years later, he was ready to share his truth, not as an attack, not as a smear, but as a testimony to the reality he lived through, a reality echoed by countless whispers behind closed doors, a reality that may finally be impossible to ignore. As the days on set unfolded, the young assistant tried desperately to push aside the gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong. He told himself over and over that this was part of paying his dues, that maybe Hollywood simply operated on a cold and cutthroat energy. But no matter how hard he tried to normalize the behavior, the stark contrast between kindness and cruelty was impossible to ignore, because while Leighton Meester and other cast members offered moments of warmth acknowledging his presence and treating him like a human being, the silent frost emanating from Blake grew heavier with every interaction. And this was not merely silence, it was laced with undertones of superiority, dismissiveness, and the unmistakable air of someone who believed that those beneath her did not even deserve the courtesy of recognition. He could feel her eyes on him sometimes, not with kindness, but with a sharp edge, a sense of mockery that cut deeper than words themselves. And it was in these small moments in the narrow hallways near her trailer, in the hushed exchanges with her entourage, that the toxic energy became palpable. He tried to stay focused on tasks, hauling cases, moving equipment, ensuring water bottles were stocked. But he found himself walking on eggshells each step near her space, a calculated effort not to draw attention to himself, for fear that attention would bring derision. He began to hear murmurs from others, in the same rank production assistants runners, young hopefuls like himself who confided in quiet tones that they too had felt the sting of her dismissiveness. Some described feeling invisible. Others spoke of biting comments that lingered long after the day had ended, and each story confirmed to him that this was not imagination. It was a pattern. And this pattern carved into him a sense of dread so heavy that he sometimes wondered if it would derail his dream of working in entertainment. Because how could he thrive in a world where cruelty was disguised as normalcy, and the most powerful faces were allowed to dictate the emotional climate without consequence? The irony hit him hardest when he recalled later lawsuits, headlines filled with words like toxic environment accusations, leveled outward as if the very storm she had once created around her had been projected onto others, and the world was expected to believe that she alone had suffered under harsh conditions. But he knew firsthand that toxicity is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is subtle, a withheld greeting, a mocking laugh, a dismissive glance. And yet these small acts pile up into a mountain of hostility that crushes those beneath it. He was not alone in feeling this, and though many were too afraid to speak at the time, he later learned that others carried their own scars, silent burdens from days spent navigating the same storm of invisible hostility. And while some outsiders scoffed, dismissing the stories as exaggerations or trivial grievances, those who had lived it knew the truth. It is not about a single moment of rudeness. It is about the culture that grows when someone powerful is allowed to treat others as less than human, and no one dares challenge it. The assistant began to reflect on how fear works in Hollywood, not always through explicit threats, but through unspoken power dynamics, a look, a silence, a mocking word spoken in the belief that the target is too insignificant to respond. The fear was not irrational. He knew because he saw how careers could be snuffed out quietly with a word or a whisper. He feared that speaking out might draw retaliation, not in the form of physical harm, but in the more insidious ways. Doors closing, opportunities, vanishing, reputations being quietly tarnished. He knew her power extended far beyond that. Set, she was linked with other powerful names, and her husband's influence only magnified the aura of untouchability surrounding her, and so he swallowed his discomfort, buried it deep, and told himself it was not worth the risk to confront or expose. Yet the memory lingered, and in the years that followed it grew heavier, not lighter, because as new scandals erupted and new lawsuits were filed, he began to see patterns that mirrored his own experience, accusations of toxicity directed outward while whispers suggested toxicity radiating inward, and each headline reignited his memories. Each interview with those defending her sharpened his sense of irony because he knew the story was far more complicated than the polished narrative being sold to the public. When he finally agreed to revisit his story years later, It was not out of vengeance, but out of a desire to shed light on what so many others had quietly endured. Wanted people to understand that behind the glitter of celebrity lies a system where those with the least power often carry the heaviest burdens, where dreams are clouded by fear, and where silence is enforced not with contracts, but with intimidation, both real and imagined. He described how, even as he tried to focus on his own budding career as a musician, the weight of that early experience haunted him. It left him doubting himself, questioning whether he belonged in creative spaces at all, and yet the irony was that the very behavior he witnessed, the dismissiveness, the mockery, the invisible walls built between celebrity and crew, were the same behaviors later mirrored in the public narratives of toxicity that filled tabloids and courtrooms. It was as if the storm that had swirled around her had been transposed onto others, leaving the true source of darkness unexamined and unspoken until now. And so he spoke, and in speaking he discovered he was not alone, his inbox filled with messages from others who had crossed paths with her over the years, and their stories resonated with his, confirming a pattern that stretched back far earlier than he had realized. Some told of brief encounters marked by the same coldness, others shared accounts, far darker, more explicit forms of cruelty that they were still too afraid to speak about publicly, but all carried the same undertone, the same wordless heaviness that had weighed on him during those days in Paris. The more stories he heard, the clearer the picture became. This was not an isolated incident. This was part of a long-running pattern, and it was this realization that gave him the courage to continue. Because in the end, what frightened him most was not her silence, not her mockery, not even the fear of retaliation, but the possibility that the truth might remain buried forever. As more time passed and as the young man matured both in age and in his career, he began to see his experience not as an isolated memory, but as part of a broader pattern that spoke volumes about the culture of fame and the illusions that surround it. Because Hollywood is not only about talent and artistry, it is about power perception and the narratives that stars and their teams work tirelessly to control. And he began to realize that what had happened to him that day on the set of Gossip Girl was not merely a star being rude. It was a window into how an entire system operates, a system where kindness costs nothing, and yet cruelty is freely given, where those at the top wield their silence and mockery as weapons, while those at the bottom absorb the blows without complaint because they fear the cost of speaking out. He thought about how his 23-year-old self had stood there stunned after being dismissed, feeling invisible, and how that single moment encapsulated the imbalance of power that defines the entertainment world on paper. He was there to help, to support, to learn. But in reality, he was little more than background noise to someone who believed she was the center of the universe. And in that imbalance lies the truth of how toxic environments are born. Because toxicity is not simply about shouting or insults. It is about indifference, disregard, and the normalization of cruelty. It is about the ripple effect that spreads when someone powerful models behavior that others imitate, either to gain favor or simply to survive. He saw how other assistants quietly mirrored her coldness, treating those even lower than themselves with dismissiveness, because that was the energy that trickled down from the top. And he realized that the damage was not just personal, it was cultural, because every young hopeful who entered that world left with scars of disillusionment, scars that whispered that kindness was weakness, and cruelty was the currency of success over time, as headlines about lawsuits, scandals, and accusations involving her surfaced. He could not help but feel the sharp irony of the situation, because here was someone painting herself as a victim of toxicity in public statements, while privately he and many others had known her as the very embodiment of the hostility she claimed to suffer from. He did not gloat over this contradiction. Rather, he felt sorrow. Sorrow that the truth was twisted, that those without power remained voiceless, while those with influence controlled the narrative, and sorrow that the public continued to consume the illusion without seeing the shadows behind the curtain. When he finally agreed to give an interview years later, his heart pounded, not out of anger but out of fear that the old fear had never truly left him. He worried that by speaking out he might once again find doors closing against him, whispers following him, shadows stretching into his own career. But he also knew that silence eats away at the soul, and that every story left untold strengthens the grip of toxicity. He chose his words carefully. He did not accuse her of crimes. He did not launch into scandalous attacks. He simply described what he had lived: the silence, the mockery, the energy that made him and others feel small, And it was enough because in that simple testimony, he unlocked a flood of recognition from others who had felt the same. The interview became not just about him, but about the hidden cost of power. Imbalances the way that Hollywood polishes its stars to shine while burying the pain of those who serve quietly in the shadows. After the interview, he began to receive messages, people he had never met reaching out to share their own experiences, some who had worked with her directly, others who had simply crossed paths in different settings. The stories varied in detail, but all carried the same core, the same sense of being dismissed, devalued, or treated as expendable. And while many were too afraid to go on record, their private confessions confirmed to him that what he had endured was not imagination and not exaggeration. It was a thread in a much larger tapestry of experiences, stretching across years and continents. The more he heard, the clearer the image became. An image of someone whose public persona diverged sharply from the private reality. Those closest to her encountered, he did not claim to hold the whole truth. He knew that experiences vary and that some might have had different interactions, but he also knew that the consistency of these private testimonies could not be ignored. And in that consistency lay the real story, not of a single rude moment, but of a culture that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked for years. What haunted him most, however, was the realization that fear was still winning, because most of the people who reached out to him were unwilling to speak publicly. Their fear of retaliation remained too great, their belief that powerful figures could crush them too strong, and so the cycle continued. Silence enforced not by contracts but by the invisible weight of intimidation. And it was in that realization that he found both sorrow and determination. Sorrow that the truth remained hidden, and determination to at least shine a small light into the darkness, because even if his story was only one among many, it was still a crack in the wall of silence, and through that crack, perhaps others might eventually find the courage to step forward too. He reflected often on the irony of being mocked by someone who later accused others of toxicity. He thought about the lawsuits and the public statements, and wondered how many people watching from afar realized the contradiction. How many understood that toxicity is not always loud, that sometimes it is woven into the smallest gestures and the quietest silences. And he wondered too if she herself ever recognized it, if she ever looked in the mirror and saw the reflection not of a victim but of someone who had once wielded power carelessly, leaving scars in her wake. The world may never know the answer, but he knew his truth, and in sharing it, he hoped others might finally see that behind the polished facade of celebrity lies a reality far darker than most dare to imagine. And now we come to the moment where everything that has been simmering beneath the surface threatens to erupt into something far more explosive than anyone imagined. Because this story is no longer about a single courtroom exchange or a leaked text message. It has become the embodiment of how quickly power can shift in Hollywood, how reputations can collapse in a single news cycle, and how alliances that once seemed unshakable can turn into traps that choke the very people who built them. Blake Lively walks into this moment with the heavy burden of knowing that her silence is no longer an option. Every pause, every hesitation is being dissected, not just by lawyers, but by an audience that wants the truth. And the irony is that the more she tries to manage the narrative, the less control she has. The narrative has a life of its own, moving through whispers, online leaks to reporters, and quiet calls behind the scenes. Taylor Swift looms large, not because she is speaking publicly, but because her words in those private texts are now the heartbeat of the trial. The texts are not just evidence, they are symbolic. They tell the story of friendship strained by ambition, of loyalty tested by scandal, and of what happens when personal boundaries collapse under the weight of public spectacle. Justin Baldoni, on the other side, carries himself with the strange composure of a man who has been doubted, ridiculed, and underestimated, and yet now finds the tide turning in his favor. His team seizes on every inconsistency, every contradiction in Blake's side, building a picture that may not be flawless but is compelling enough to shift the balance. This is no longer about who said what during a film shoot. It is about whether an entire machine was constructed to bury him and protect others. Ryan Reynolds finds himself caught in a cruel dilemma because the courtroom battle that was supposed to be Blake's is now his too. His brand, his image, his career, all tied to how this unfolds. Whispers swirl about whether he knew more than he admitted, whether his attempts at humor in interviews were a smokescreen for deeper anxieties. Brian Friedman, the attorney with the razor-sharp instinct, sees an opening and he drives into it, relentlessly raising questions that cut deeper than anyone thought possible. Did Blake exaggerate? Did Ryan assist? Did Taylor resist behind closed doors? These questions reverberate like thunder, and the world outside can only speculate. The media spins every angle. Tabloids go wild with speculation. Insiders leak contradictory accounts. Fans clash online, with some insisting that Blake is being unfairly targeted, while others argue that this is long overdue justice. The suspense is suffocating, because no one knows which piece of evidence will drop next, and when it does, who it will destroy. This is the kind of scandal that doesn't just end careers, it reshapes industries. Studios begin to whisper about canceling deals, brand partners reconsider contracts. Celebrities who once stood proudly beside Blake begin to retreat into silence, issuing vague statements of support that sound more like exit strategies than loyalty. And through it all, the judge maintains a steady hand, reminding the courtroom that the law is what matters here, not the noise outside. Yet even the judge cannot ignore the cultural weight pressing into the case. Every journalist in the room scribbles furiously because they know that history is being written. In real time, what makes this final act so haunting is not the certainty of an outcome, but the certainty of devastation. There will be no clean ending no matter who wins the court battle, because reputations once shredded cannot be repaired easily. Trust once broken cannot be glued back together, and relationships once betrayed will never return to what they were. Blake faces the impossible choice of protecting herself or others. Ryan faces the reality that his shield of charm may not withstand this storm. Justin faces the possibility of vindication, but at what personal cost? And Taylor faces the unwanted role of kingmaker, her private words carrying the power to tip the scales of justice without her ever stepping foot in the room. The eye. Suspense does not fade as the case nears conclusion. It sharpens every headline, every leak. Every silence is a drumbeat, building toward an explosion. And when the verdict comes, whether tomorrow or weeks from now, it will not just decide who is legally right, it will decide who in Hollywood still holds power, who has been stripped of it, and who has been revealed in their truest, most unfiltered form. This is why the world cannot look away, because beneath the glittering surface of celebrity lies a battlefield more ruthless than anyone imagined, and now every step forward feels like the edge of a cliff in the end. What this entire saga shows us is not just the collapse of one celebrity carefully polished image, but the way Hollywood itself is being forced to reckon with accountability. For decades, it was enough to smile for the cameras, walk the red carpets, and let the PR machines spin every controversy into nothing. But now every misstep, every word, every betrayal is recorded, remembered, dissected, and replayed until the truth cannot be hidden forever. Blake Lively entered this battle with all the power of fame, fortune, and industry connections. Yet piece by piece, those shields have been stripped away, and what remains is a raw portrait of someone fighting desperately to keep control of a story that has spiraled far beyond her grip. The revelations about Taylor Swift, the courtroom battles with Justin Baldoni, the whispers about Ryan Reynolds, and the public fallout have painted a picture that no studio, no lawyer, no crisis manager can completely rewrite. The question now is not whether Blake Lively can win back the narrative, but whether she can survive the storm that has already engulfed her career, her friendships, and her reputation in an age where authenticity is currency and hypocrisy is punished. The audience has made their verdict louder than any judge or jury. People are watching, not with sympathy, but with fascination, horror, and sometimes even vindication. The empire is crumbling. The mask is slipping, and the truth is forcing its way out. Whether she fights back with another lawsuit, another PR stunt, or retreats into silence, the damage is already done. The court of public opinion has spoken, and its judgment is final. This is not just another Hollywood scandal. This is the unraveling of a legacy.